This whole video is going to take place in just one location. Sauron's Island of Werewolves. Maya Gavan and Melanin am Menig Swilaid. My name's Rainbow Dave, and welcome to the 5th video in our Beren and Lúthien Untangled playlist. And this is going to be the most epic video in this playlist so far, because we have finally gotten to the showdown at Tol In Gawhoth. So, in the last video, I talked about how Beren and the elven lord Finrod Felagund, along with an elf called Edrahil and 9 other elven companions, were all captured by Sauron after Finrod was beaten in a magical duel of music, an epic rap battle, if you will, or perhaps the very definition of death metal. Anyway, Sauron stripped them of their disguises and he locked them in his dungeons to be devoured one at a time by his werewolf executioner. But just before I come back to them, I want to talk a little bit about exactly what kind of bad guys we're dealing with here. Because typically, in Tolkien's works, when the heroes are captured by the villains, they face orcs, or sometimes evil men. But that is not what we are dealing with in Tol In Gawhoth. Because this is the island of werewolves, and at least one vampire. And so, in this video, I am going to focus on some of the most mysterious villains in the entire Legendarium. And I'll begin with a quick overview of what exactly Tolkien means by werewolves, because they're not like the kind of wolfmen that we are mostly familiar with from modern pop culture. These guys don't turn into like bipedal wolves at the full moon. There are no silver bullets. These are simply wolves. Except they're not simply wolves. The question of what's the difference between wargs and werewolves is quite a complicated one, and it's one that I do try to tackle in this video, so check that out after this one if you're interested. But the werewolves of Tol In Gawhoth are certainly very different from the wolves and wargs that we see elsewhere in the Legendarium. In the Grey Annals, Tolkien tells us of evil creatures that walked in wolf shapes during the years of starlight, before the First Age properly began. And this is probably the origin of the werewolves. In the Silmarillion, we are told that Sauron's werewolves are fell beasts inhabited by dreadful spirits that he had imprisoned in their bodies. And I think these dreadful spirits are the key to understanding Tolkien's werewolves. On the one hand, I think it's possible that they are corrupted Maya, not like dissimilar to the Balrogs, which would certainly make werewolves among the Dark Lord's most powerful servants. But I think it is also possible that these dreadful spirits could have come from captured and corrupted elves. Could it be that these are twisted elven feyar, elven souls that were trapped in the bodies of wolves instead of orcs? They can speak, after all. Or perhaps instead they are something a bit more like Glaurung. There is an interesting comparison, I think, to be made between Glaurung, the first dragon and the father of all future dragons, and the father of all future werewolves. And the first werewolf, the one who sired the entire race, is a top lieutenant of Sauron's, and I guess a sort of second in command in Tol In Gawhoth. His name is Drow Glooween, and Drow Glooween is going to play quite an important role a little later in this video. Tolkien describes him as a dread beast, old in evil. And he is the lord of all werewolves, and in a few episodes' time, we'll see the mightiest of all Drow Glooween's children. But I do want to point out right now that although werewolves may seem like a very First Age Silmarillion kind of thing, and we may think that the line of Drow Glooween has long since ended by the time of the more familiar stories such as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, this is not actually the case. In the second book of The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf tells Frodo that not all the Dark Lord's servants are orcs and trolls, there are wolves and werewolves in the service of the Dark Tower. So, although they're not in the spotlight for a great deal of the Legendarium, werewolves have been serving Sauron for over 6,500 years by the time of The Lord of the Rings. However, before I move on with the story, there is one more servant of Sauron's to talk about, and she is even more mysterious than the werewolves. She is Sauron's Herald, and she is almost entirely unique within the Legendarium, for she is Tolkien's only named vampire, Thuringwethil. And Thuringwethil is not an easy name to pronounce correctly, but I feel confident that what I just said there was right. It's definitely not Thuringwethil, it's Thuringwethil. Thurin means secret in Sindarin, and Gwath means shadow. The eel on the end makes it feminine. Anyway, as interesting as correct pronunciation may or may not be, vampires are way more interesting. And so I'll briefly go over the very limited information that we have about Thuringwethil. And I really do mean limited here, because just like the werewolves, it would seem that Tolkien's vampires are very different from the vampires of modern popular fiction. Despite some of the art that you may find on the internet if you go looking, Thuringwethil is not like some sexy creature of the night in a cocktail dress. She is described by Tolkien as bat-fell, with great fingered wings that were barbed at each joint's end with an iron claw. Thuringwethil is basically a giant evil bat, with blood-sucking being the only similarity she shares with like the vampires of modern fiction. And there's an interesting unanswered question here of whether Thuringwethil is, like always, a bat, and that's just her form, kind of like the werewolves, or is she a skin changer, a bit like an evil version of Beorn, a shapeshifter? Or maybe she is a Maya. There's pretty much nothing we can say for certain, and to be honest, there's really not much to be said at all about Tolkien's vampires other than that, except that just like Drow Glooween and the werewolves of the Third Age, it is possible to speculate that some lesser children of Thuringwethil's might have survived long after her death. And this is just speculation, but in The Hobbit, we are told that during the Battle of the Five Armies, great bats swirled about the heads and ears of elves and men, or fastened vampire-like on the stricken. So I guess it's possible that these blood-sucking vampire bats of the Third Age might be to Thuringwethil what the werewolves of the Third Age are to Drow Glooween, or the dragons of the Third Age are to Glaurung, or even the spiders of Mirkwood might be to Ungoliant. Anyway, apart from saying that she is Sauron's vampire herald, there's really nothing more to say about Thuringwethil for now. So I'll turn the story back to the desperate plight of Beren and Finrod and their 10 elven companions deep in the dungeons of Tol Ien Gawrhoth. So in the last video I said that although Sauron had stripped Beren's company of their disguises, he can't quite break their minds or discern the true purpose of their travelling north in orc forms. And so Sauron pivots to a strategy of psychological torture. Beren and Finrod and friends are all locked up in the same dungeon, and from time to time they saw two eyes kindled in the dark. And although each of the companions was threatened with a cruel death, none would betray the truth to Sauron. And so, one by one, these elven companions stay loyal, and then they are devoured by Sauron's werewolf executioner. Which brings us back to Edrahil, the very first elf who stood up to follow Finrod and Beren out of Nargothrond to accomplish the quest of the Silmaril. He is a lesser known elf, but he's a really cool guy. But unfortunately, this is the end for him. Edrahil is devoured in Sauron's dark dungeon, and so are all 9 of the other companions. They are slain cruelly, but none betrayed their lord. And so, after who knows how long, there are only 2 characters left, Beren and Finrod Felagund. And the reason that Sauron left Finrod Felagund until the last is kind of an insight into Sauron's personality and his arrogance. In fact, I think this is an example of one of Sauron's greatest weaknesses. He simply just does not believe that men could ever be a threat. He doesn't even entertain the idea that Finrod might not be the one in charge, that he might just be a helper on Beren's quest instead of the other way round. It seems that Sauron is incapable of conceiving of a reason why a much more powerful character like Finrod would ever choose to aid a less powerful character like Beren. It's just compassion and humility are such alien concepts to Sauron. And so Sauron decides to save Finrod for last, and he sends his werewolf to kill Beren instead. And this seems like a pretty impossible situation for our hero to escape from. He is chained up in a dungeon, he has no weapon, no means of escape, no means of defense, and this wolf has already killed 10 of his elven companions. And the truth is that Beren is completely powerless in this moment. If he were alone, he would not survive it. But he's not alone. Sauron foolishly let Finrod Felagund live. And so, in this moment, the entire trajectory of Finrod's life comes down to one decision, one oath of abiding friendship. So, as the wolf descended on Beren, Finrod Felagund put forth all his power and burst his bonds. He wrestled with the werewolf and slew it with his hands and his teeth. I don't know exactly how he does it, but Finrod must tap into some massively powerful Calaquendi magic in this moment, because with nothing but his own body, he is able to break his chains and slay his captor. But he put forth all his power, and he himself was wounded to the death. Finrod Felagund gave his own life to save Beren's, to save the son of Barahir. He was an elven lord, a king, really, of unparalleled renown and reputation, but he died for a mortal, because he swore an oath to protect him. And it is, I think, very important to note that Finrod Felagund did not give his life for nothing. He died so that Beren could live, and because of that decision, Beren is able to change the world. He is able to begin the line of dominoes that will eventually topple Morgoth himself. I hope that's some kind of consolation, because honestly, this is otherwise really brutal. This is one of the saddest deaths in the Silmarillion, and there are loads. Finrod was the most wonderful elf. He was such a good dude, and yet he died in the dungeons of the very watchtower that he once built to save the son of the man who once saved him. Among Finrod's last words are, "It may be that we shall not meet a second time in death or life. Farewell." And then Finrod Felagund died beside Beren, the fairest and most beloved of the house of Finwë, and Beren mourned beside him in despair. So, of all the many, many dark things that Beren's already been through, this has got to be towards the top of the list. He is chained, alone in Sauron's dungeon, with 11 dead companions and a dead werewolf beside him. But as Beren slips into despair, he suddenly hears a song that no walls of stone could hinder. At first he thinks he's dreaming, for he can see the stars shining above him as if he were outside, and he can hear nightingales singing in the trees. And so, all alone and in the dark, Beren sings a song of his own in answer. He sings about the stars of Varda, and particularly the Valakirka, that's the sickle of the gods, which we would call either the plough or the Big Dipper in the real world. And in Tolkien's mythology, this constellation was kindled by Varda herself, Elbereth Githorniel, the queen of the Valar, and she hung these stars in the north as a challenge and a sign for the fall of Morgoth. But when Beren finishes his song about these stars, all strength left him, and he fell down into darkness. But his song had been heard. You see, these nightingales that Beren heard, that was not a dream. What he heard was the song of Lúthien, like the literal song of Lúthien. She has come to Tol in Gawahoth, and she's come to rescue her man. In the last video, I talked about Lúthien's escape from Doriath and her subsequent run-in with the brothers Celegorm and Curufin. And it was in their company that Lúthien befriended Huan, the hunting hound, one of the most awesome dogs in all of fiction. And it was Huan who bore Lúthien from her second captivity and carried her all the way north to Tol in Gawahoth. So, in the very hour that Finrod Felagund was slain, Lúthien stood on the bridge to Sauron's Isle, and she sang her song. And Beren heard it, and he answered it, and now Lúthien knows that he is still alive. The only problem, there's a whole bunch of werewolves between them. Oh, and also Sauron. You see, far up in his dark tower, Sauron had also heard Lúthien's song. He was wrapped in his black thought, but he smiled hearing her voice, for he knew she is the daughter of melyn. And don't forget that melyn and Sauron are two of the only confirmed Maiar that are active in Middle-earth at this time, one on the side of good, the other on the side of Morgoth. But they are both Maiar, and so way back in the very beginning, they would have known each other. They would have been created together in the Timeless Halls, and we can certainly speculate that even in the years of the Lamps, melyn and Sauron may have known each other and lived side by side, back when Sauron was Mairon, the Admirable. Anyway, regardless of that, Sauron knows that the daughter of melyn would make an exceptionally profitable captive, and if he were the one who brought her as a slave before Morgoth, his reward would be great. So Sauron sent a wolf to the bridge to capture Lúthien and to kill any companions she may have travelled with. But what neither Sauron nor his wolf accounted for was the presence of Huan. Remember, Huan is a hunting hound of Valinor, the chief of the wolfhounds, and he is swift and tireless. But I did mention in the last video that Huan has a bit of a macabre destiny. We're told that it was decreed that in Middle-earth he should meet death, but not until he encountered the mightiest wolf that would ever walk the world. Now, that is a bit of sinister foreshadowing, but Huan's death is not this day. Sauron's wolf is not the mightiest wolf ever to walk the world, and so Huan slew it silently. And then Sauron sent out more wolves, and Huan killed all of them. So, eventually, Sauron sent out his top dog, no pun intended, Drow Glooween. And Huan fought a bitter battle with Drow Glooween, for his might was great. And the fight was long and fierce, but eventually the father of all werewolves was beaten by the wolfhound of Valinor, and Drow Glooween fled back to his master and then died at Sauron's feet. But Drow Glooween's last words are pretty iconic. With his dying breath, he says to Sauron, "Huan is there." And then that's it. The end of Drow Glooween. However, as it goes, Sauron is pretty familiar with this decree that Huan can only be killed by the greatest wolf ever to walk the world, and because Sauron is a shapeshifter and a master of phantoms and a lord of werewolves, he decides that he is in fact the greatest wolf ever to walk the world, and so he took upon himself the form of a werewolf and made himself the mightiest that had yet walked the world. And Wolf Sauron, as Tolkien calls him, must have been a pretty terrifying sight, as we are told that Huan leapt aside at the great horror of his approach. But Lúthien stands her ground. We are told that Sauron sprang upon her, and Tolkien mentions the menace of the fell spirit in his eyes and the foul vapour of his breath, but Lúthien withstands him. Remember in the last video when I talked about Lúthien singing a song of power that magically caused her hair to grow long, and then she used that hair to weave a shadowy cloak that was enchanted with spells of sleep? Well, in her duel with Sauron, this shadowy sleep cloak comes back in an important way. Lúthien cast a fold of her dark cloak before his eyes, and he stumbled, for a fleeting drowsiness came upon him. But then it is Huan's turn to take over. He sprang at Sauron and thus began one of the most epic duels so far in the story. We're told that the howling, baying noise of the fight was so thunderous that watchers on the mountain tops of High King Fingon's realm could hear the battle across the valley, and they were dismayed by it. But this is another instance where I'll have to use Tolkien's exact words here, because he paints such an awesome picture of Huan and Wolf Sauron locked in battle. And it's not a battle that ends well for Sauron. We are told that no wizardry nor spell, neither fang nor venom nor devil's art nor beast strength could overthrow Huan of Valinor, and he took his foe by the throat and pinned him down. I guess Sauron was wrong about being the greatest werewolf. Anyway, while Sauron is under Huan's claws, he shapeshifts again, from wolf to serpent, and from monster to his own accustomed form. But he could not elude the grip of Huan without forsaking his body utterly. And so it seems that Sauron only has two choices. Either he can yield to Lúthien and hope that she will spare him, or he could die. And when I say die, I don't mean like the permanent death that mortals face, but his body would be slain, and this would suck for Sauron, because he has already rebelled against Ilúvatar, so he can't just build himself another body like the other Maiar can. Well, actually, obviously, we know from The Lord of the Rings that he kind of can, but that takes thousands and thousands of years, and we can speculate that that is only possible because the One Ring still endures. We know that after the One Ring is destroyed, Sauron is left permanently incorporeal, and his spirit will never be able to rebuild a physical form to be housed in. And this is obviously happening pre-One Ring, so if Sauron lets his body be destroyed by Huan in this moment, that's pretty much game over. He'll be stripped of his raiment of flesh, and his ghost be sent quaking back to Morgoth. In fact, Lúthien even says to Sauron in this moment, "There everlastingly thy naked self shall endure the torment of his scorn, pierced by his eyes, unless thou yield to me the mastery of thy tower." And so, unsurprisingly really, Sauron yields, and Lúthien took the mastery of the Isle and all that was there. She is now the Lord of Tol in Gawahoth, but as soon as Huan releases his grip on Sauron, in that instant, Sauron took the form of a vampire, great as a dark cloud across the moon, and he fled, dripping blood from his throat upon the trees. And I'll get back to Lúthien in just a sec, but believe it or not, this is actually the last time that we see Sauron for a really long time. The First Age is far from over, and after this tale finishes, I still have plenty more to talk about, the Children of Húrin, the Fall of Gondolin, the War of Wrath, and much more. But the next time that we'll see Sauron is after all of those stories have finished. We don't see Sauron again until after the eventual defeat of Morgoth and the very last moments of the First Age. And I think this is quite telling. Sauron was soundly defeated just now, and part of me wonders if he fears Morgoth's retribution. But I also wonder if Sauron really has that much loyalty left to Morgoth after all of this. I go into a lot more detail on this in my Sauron character study video, but I do really get the impression that after Morgoth returned to Middle-earth, after his imprisonment in Valinor, Sauron slowly began to lose more and more faith in him. We know from the Second Age that what Sauron really wants is order and perfection, or at least his own kind of warped sense of perfection, in which he rules all things in Middle-earth and he controls everything. But perhaps, contrary to popular belief, what Sauron does not want is to destroy Middle-earth. Middle-earth is his canvas. However, Morgoth, on the other hand, he seems different. Morgoth is all about discord and corruption and perversion and pollution. He doesn't want a perfect Middle-earth. He just wants to spoil any and all good things that his enemies have managed to build. Morgoth is evil in a very, very destructive way, but Sauron is evil in a kind of constructive way. He is a creator and a crafter, after all. He is all about building things. And Sauron's designs are just so utterly incompatible with Morgoth's. I know we often think of Sauron as being Morgoth's faithful disciple, and to be fair, there certainly was a time in the distant past when he was, but I think that by this point in the story, Sauron is very much ready to break free of his old master. The next time we see him, he will put on his fair hue again and denounce Morgoth. He is very much his own agent with his own designs from this moment on, and we are never told of Sauron serving Morgoth ever again. So what does Sauron do for the next 100 years or so? Well, we are told that in vampire's form, he flew to Tower Nufuin. That's the haunted forest under Nightshade, where he'd previously tortured and murdered Beren's friend Gorlim. And there, in Tower Nufuin, he dwelt, filling the forest with horror. So it is pretty cool to imagine, I think, that throughout the rest of the First Age, and all the epic drama that's still to come, there is some dark and incredibly spooky corner of a haunted forest where Sauron dwells as a vampire, and kind of begins his own journey towards independence. These years as a vampire in Tower Nufuin are perhaps Sauron's origins as a future Dark Lord in his own right. Maybe he even recalls Beren's ring from back in Tolkien Gowerhoth, the Ring of Barahir, and maybe it begins to cross Sauron's mind that rings could be a really cool thing to look into. But that is where I'm going to have to leave Sauron for a good long while, right up until the end of the First Age. But it's not quite the end of this video, because back in Tolkien Gowerhoth, Lúthien steps onto the island that she is now the master of, and she declared her power. Using some kind of musical magic, Lúthien drew down the gates, she toppled the walls, and she laid bare the pits of the dungeons. And after she brings Tolkien Gowerhoth to ruin, we are told about a really harrowing detail that just reminds us why Sauron and Morgoth are such terrible people. Because out of the broken cells and dungeons come loads of former prisoners. He didn't know it at the time, but Beren was not alone in Sauron's captivity. Lúthien witnesses all these many thralls and captives come forth in wonder and dismay, shielding their eyes against the pale moonlight, for they had lain long in the darkness of Sauron. And I just find this so sad. It's a reminder that both Sauron and Morgoth have all of these poor prisoners locked in their dungeons, where they are just tortured and tormented and corrupted into thralls for potentially hundreds of years. I can't help shiver when I think about the dungeons of Angband, or Barad-dûr, or Dol Guldur, or any other stronghold of the Dark Lords. They must be among the most horrendous places in all of Middle-earth. But on this day, at least, the dungeons of Tol in Gawhoth are laid bare, and many miserable prisoners of Sauron's are finally set free by Lúthien. However, the one prisoner that Lúthien is actually looking for is the one prisoner that she can't find. Her and Huan seek out Beren, and when they do eventually find him, Beren is lying deathly still, mourning beside the body of Finrod Felagund. In fact, Lúthien fears that he too may be dead. But when Beren feels her touch, he comes back to the light out of the pits of despair, and they looked again upon one another, and the day rising over the dark hill shone upon them. And so Beren and Lúthien are finally reunited. This is the first time that they've truly been together since Beren was seized by the servants of Thingol and brought before his throne back in Doriath. And obviously this is nowhere near the end of their story, they still have a Silmaril to get to, but this is at least a happy reprieve in their story. This is no longer the quest of Beren and the quest of Lúthien, there is now just the quest of Beren and Lúthien. And so, that's what I'm going to talk about in future videos, but I want to end this video by returning for the final time to Finrod Felagund. Because when Beren and Lúthien are finally reunited, the first thing they do is bury the body of Felagund upon the hilltop of his own isle, and it was clean again. And the green grave of Finrod Finarfin's son, fairest of all the princes of the elves, remained inviolate until the land was changed and broken. But as sad as this may sound, there is actually a happy ending to Finrod's story too. Because although he is now dead and we will never ever see him again in Middle-earth, the soul of Finrod, his Feia, is returned to the uttermost west where he came from. And like all dead elves, Finrod's Feia is held and judged within the halls of Mandos. But unlike most other dead elves, Finrod is not judged for long. More so than perhaps any other exiled prince of the Noldor, Finrod did nothing wrong. He was only ever a positive influence, and he was such a noble agent of Ilúvatar's plan. It may seem tempting to compare him to other great elves of his family like Fingolfin or Galadriel, but even among them, Finrod is exceptional. When the High King Fingolfin died fighting Morgoth, he did an incredible thing, and I imagine he was surely judged very positively by Mandos and the Valar, but he did do some bad things. He did take part in the kinslaying, for example. Same with Galadriel. She didn't take part in the kinslaying, but she was initially tempted by Feanor, and thousands of years later, by the One Ring. She is an incredibly wonderful person, but she's not quite her brother. We are told that Finrod Felagund is unique in being the only elf to die in the First Age and be rehoused to live again in Valinor before the end of that age. And in Valinor, Finrod was finally reunited with his father Finarfin. We are told in the Silmarillion that Finrod walks with Finarfin his father beneath the trees in Eldamar. And we are told in the Lay of Lúthien that in Valinor Finrod was reunited with the elf maiden that he loved, Amarie, the lady that Finrod left behind. So, although there's still a lot of hardships left to overcome for Beren and Lúthien, take some solace knowing that once Finrod Felagund fulfilled his oath, he spent the rest of Middle-earth's history living in peace and paradise with his father and his wife. Now, as I say, we're only about halfway through the tale of Beren and Lúthien, but I'm going to take a 1 week interval here, because in next week's video, I want to do a character study of Finrod Felagund and a breakdown of his whole life from like the beginning to the end. I think a little later down the line I'll probably do similar retrospective videos for Feanor and Fingolfin and the other major characters that we lose along the way. Anyway, after that Finrod Felagund one-off bonus video, I will definitely continue Beren and Lúthien's tale, and I will continue with their quest, whilst also returning to the machinations of Celegorm and Curufin, as well as taking a look at how our heroes make it up to the very gates of Angband. So, to make sure you don't miss that, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. Anyway, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy and navaer melyn.